Hey, Tristen, welcome to the channel and welcome to the Gauntlet.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Great. Well, I'm sure everybody knows the format by now. So here we are, round one. Which would you like to talk about? Music, economics, or cosmology?
Now, is this I suppose cosmology from like a philosophical perspective or like an ontological kind of uh
Uh, well, I don't think anybody has actually picked cosmology yet. So let me read you
Well, I
some of the
guess I
possible
should
questions
I
that
should
might come
pick
up.
it to have some fun, right? Yeah.
We, why
Let-
don't, yeah, let's have a look. I can always try and roll it back if you terribly regret this decision. So the universe is a simulation. An alien civilization seeded Earth with life, or quantum mechanics and general relativity will never be reconciled.
These are some interesting questions, actually. Um,
Yeah,
I've thought quite a bit about quantum mechanics and general relativity, so maybe that's a good starting point. Um,
you want to look that in?
yeah, yeah, we'll talk about that.
All right.
I think if you want to give some description of, I guess. Um,
Well, no. I was just wondering
mhm.
which direction your instincts
Oh,
go. Are
yeah.
you bullish about the unification of these things?
I'm not exactly bullish on quantum mechanics in general.
Oh, wow.
I think it's there's a lot of questions and a lot of answers that haven't been formulated yet, especially when it comes to probability. So we kind of there's this alternate presentation of mechanics or physics where the universe is basically fundamentally on a small micro level probabilistic, and yet we're capable of predicting with pretty reasonable accuracy how probability will play out when doing an
Hmm.
experiment. But the actual mechanics of probability, like, is this actual thing probabilistic? Is there some actually determining mechanism that's leading it towards one way or another? Those questions haven't really been settled, and so there's there's a there's a possibility that um, classic physics can be reconciled with quantum mechanics when more is known about the actual operation of quantum mechanics. And I think we've kind of jumped the gun by saying, quantum mechanics is exactly as we now assume it is based on the current science that exists, even though we basically don't have tools of observation of anything that's going on at this level. Only like electric wave readings and probability field measurements, which are not exactly precise, right? You're not making some steel girders out of that kind of mathematics. Um, I mean,
So
do you think that
are you
they
are
can't
you
be?
familiar with
Mhm.
Bell's inequality?
Um,
There's an experiment that
mhm.
was done in the 60s that explores the question of whether or not there are um, kind of hidden variables. There's this question of, I think Einstein put it as, does God play dice? At a
Yeah.
fundamental level, is a quantum event actually random, or is there some deterministic thing behind the scenes that leads to it? And I can never remember the specific details, but there's this experiment um, that that I think is John Bell did, and it comes out with a statistical inequality that would. The argument is it would not be possible if there was some hidden variables. I hope I've explained that approximately correct.
Yeah, I understand. It I've heard similar theories, and I think I've seen similar experiments. I don't think it's just the one. I think after, like in the 60s and 70s, there were a lot of like discussion on like what could be possible mechanics that are operating deterministically behind the scenes, um, and it wasn't even like when quantum mechanics was formulated that it was necessarily decided that um, it was deterministic. I mean, I know that there was a lot of discussion in the 30s and the 40s about um, whether or not like mechanics as a whole is non-classical or classical. And I
Hmm.
forget the name of the guy. There was a famous school of thought that was trying to reconcile classical mechanics with quantum mechanics. Um, I think it's possible that there's been experiments that have shown that it would like shown doubt on the question of whether or not something could be happening mechanistically or deterministically behind the scenes to lock probability um, into a particular uh, metaphysical necessity towards actual dice rolling. But um, I haven't read that much lately. I haven't really thought about quantum mechanics in 3 or 4 years, and it's like one of those things where you get out of it, you don't read it frequently,
Yeah,
and you're just like, I don't remember any of the details because all of this was kind of so
yeah.
so specific.
There's loads of really cool experiments that are difficult to explain. As in, you can do the experiment, you can even do it yourself. Some of these are not that hard to do. The probably the most simple one would be something like a two-slit experiment, right?
Yeah.
You just have two slits and have a look at the diffraction pattern you get. Now, if you want to do things like shooting one electron at a time and observing each of the electrons arriving and landing, and the fact that the diffraction pattern still happens even one electron at a time, you're going to need some fancier equipment. But the point is that I don't think we need to be too skeptical that there's something weird that there's something beyond classical mechanics going on in the world. It's just, the way that you interpret those experiments that's what I feel like the door is wide open on. Okay, we've got this set of weird results. How do you put the pieces together? And there's like a million different ways that people explain, try to come up with an elegant and simple world model that still explains all of the data.
At some level, it may be true that class mechanics isn't all that's happening, right? There's something about class mechanics that isn't capturing what's happening in reality completely. But whatever we do know about what is happening with classical mechanics still has to happen, and so
Hmm.
any explanation has to accord for the fact that um, the quantum level can't basically disprove the classical level because we're pretty seriously, I
We've
guess,
had- we yeah we've got
invested in
lots
it.
of first person experience of classical mechanics. It makes me think a little bit of if you uh, if you look at the movement of crowds, like large groups of people become quite predictable. You can design the shape of a street such that the flow of traffic goes in a predictable direction. And yet, the individual people and their psychology are very complex and difficult to predict. You can study it for um, your whole lifetime and still be finding nuances about an individual person's behavior. So if that's always seems to me the analogy that classical mechanics is a macroscopic field, whereas quantum mechanics is microscopic. Now, maybe one day we'll bury in deeper than whatever QM is trying to explain, and there'll be some, in the same way as we once thought of atoms as the smallest possible particle, and now we've okay, subatomic, kind of a stupid coinage, but that's where we're at, right? Um, I could
Subparticle.
imagine, yeah,
um,
one day we'll
it-
think, oh, quantum mechanics, whatever answer we come to on that question is like,
Subquantum.
yeah, exactly.
There's
Well, how about the other half of the question then? General relativity. Do you have thoughts on special and general relativity?
um, there's I wanted to ask you a question. If you've read the the Manifest and Scientific Image of Man by Wilfred Sellers,
No,
um,
tell me about it.
it it presents a view that, like, in our history as human beings, right, we kind of had this sort of mythological worldview that we first inherited. Like when we saw the wind, we thought maybe that wind was alive, or we saw trees and we're like, the trees are alive, and then we saw stones and the stones were alive. So we breed like the smallest unit of consideration for man was the entity. Um, and then recently, within like the past 250 years, we've now taken like this scientific image seriously, right? That like when we look at a table, a stone, a chair, a person, there's actually these like smaller things that are actually the real thing operating. In the paper, he's trying to like reconcile, like, what do we do here? Do we say that this entity view is primary? Do we say that the the view of the scientific particles are primary? Does one not exist because the other exists? Do they both exist and are capable of being consistent? I think that's when it comes to when you were talking about scope, right? The macro level versus the micro level with the cosmos, the things we see on a day-to-day basis, and then what's happening at the quantum level. Relativity is kind of general or special relativity is kind of just a perspective on scope as well, right? You're fixating on a particular kind of experience that is unique to how humans are viewing the cosmos. That's not to say it's subjective in nature, but it's your questions are kind of going to be answered by the way that you pose what kind of entities you consider important. What are you dealing with as a base of knowledge? And so I can't really say I'm quite well read on general versus special relativity, but
Sure.
I think the questions are
It's really
often
interesting what you were saying there about the reality or non-reality of either entities or their kind of low-level constituent particles. A few years ago, I kind of came to the conclusion that I guess I'm a non-realist with respect to entities. I kind of decided that we as humans label a chair, and it's a useful linguistic concept. But the thing that actually exists, or the things that exist, are the atoms or the subatomic particles or whatever that make up the chair. It's only our human analysis that puts a label onto the concept of a chair as an indivisible. I mean, it's indivisible as an object in the sense that there's a center of mass and a force applied to it will move the whole group of things together. But then we will also use language to say the chair, and we will include both the wooden part and the cushion that's sitting on it, but we won't include the book that's been put on the chair. Do you see what I mean? That
yeah.
the entity, in the case of physical objects at least, is I kind of maybe somebody could convince me otherwise, but my default assumption, and I do think other people are different from me in this, but my default assumption is the object is a human linguistic category, and it doesn't have any kind of higher, platonic form.
Yeah, I also don't agree that there's a platonic form, but there is a form, right? Like I'm wearing a hat. It is a hat.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and have you heard of this is a common example that I used to hear semi frequently. There, if you were to have a life form that was like at the subatomic level, right? Like they observed reality through some sensory mechanism that
Mhm.
allowed them to see the subatomic happenings much easier. Um, if they investigated the world and had like a human type cognition and wanted to actually investigate everything in the universe, at some point they'd have to grapple with the fact that these subatomic things that they're observing are on the macro level operating in some fixed specific way to create things like objects. So I I think if you um, make it less of an epistemological question of like, well, do we as humans like categorize things like this or that? Even if you were operating just from the basis of subatomic particles and building upwards, you'd have to come to the conclusion that these things are acting in some way together to create some kind of
Hmm.
experience. Um,
Maybe to give an analogy, then I feel like this is the fourth time I've used the word analogies during this conversation. Um, if you analyze traffic in and out of a city, people commute in for work and then leave in the evenings to their houses, and it's almost like the city is breathing. And if you're a commuter, you are part of that inflow in the morning and then part of the exhale in the evening. And you can analyze the mass of traffic, all the cars together, as an object. So you could kind of label it as an entity. You as a person who's a part of that movement, your decisions are based on quite specific things to do with your employer and your discussions with your line manager and your personal life, and so there's lots of complexity. But again, the entity of a collection of cars that's moving in or out of the city together, um, I would argue, as a human, it's a very real and valuable label to apply. But I don't think that there's some metaphysical reality to the collection of cars moving together. It's a frame of analysis. It's a perspective that you can use to analyze a complex system.
Isn't there some complication though when bringing in human subjects, right? Because human subjects are, um, I mean, if you believe they have free will, if you believe that they're operating in the universe by decision, that they're not just like like a chair is made up and has certain properties, and if you do certain things to it, it'll break, or if you do certain things to it, it will be refurbished. Um, Human beings, like the movement of traffic, is like such a conglomeration of so many different actual active processes that
Mhm.
it seems less reasonable to call it an entity, though you can conceptualize that for a particular purpose. But it's clearly different kind of entity than an entity that has no volition. Like volition becomes like almost I would say it's like consciousness or volition itself is a different metaphysical state than non-consciousness. And so you can't really view conscious entities and non-conscious entities as metaphysically similar.
Mm.
And so I'm not sure that the example really draws out the nature of just our conceptualization of these bodies in motion or whatever.
That's interesting. And I agree with you that there is a stark difference between conscious and non-conscious being. I think that the analogy holds, but I would have to argue. You're right that it's not automatically valid. I'd have to
Mhm.
work to show that it's, if you have a um, in in the case of, say, a water balloon, it's clearly a single object. It clearly contains a fluid, and the fluid is a large number of particles, each moving independently, um, each with their own sort of velocity and position. I guess this is a little in the weeds, really. I guess what
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
saying is
it's a little bit.
that
It's
the
almost a
the fl-
scientific question, right? It's
the
not.
fluid on aggregate has very predictable properties, and those are emergent from. Maybe that's another interesting place to go, is an ant colony. So again, insects are individually following rules that are not at a high conceptual level, that the individual ant is not thinking about the emergent effect of their action. So the emergent effect can have a great deal more complexity to it. The threshold at which an insect will detect a chemical and behave is finely tuned, such that the aggregate property of all the ants together deals with the environment that the colony exists in. And the insect is not choosing the threshold with an end in mind, but there is maybe ants are halfway between in the sense that you've got the particles, which are clearly deterministic. Just let's assume we're not going to go down to non-classical where it all becomes muddy again. You got it's kind of like a stacked architecture, isn't it? QM, theoretically, some people will say random, genuinely random, classical mechanics over the top. Then you get to biological life, and then a layer above that becomes predictable again when you look at the life en masse. You could probably analyze the way that individual cells work as another layer in the middle of that. Anyway, we've gone over 20 minutes on the first round, so I feel like we should probably wrap up there. But did you have any last thoughts you want to throw in here?
Yeah, I'm curious exactly what emergent properties means here when it comes to like collections of life forms. It's kind of easier to say like an emergent property of an individual life form is this kind of conscious experience, but like the emergent property of the system of life forms is perhaps a more dicey kind of postulate, and I'm not exactly sure what it means. But maybe we don't need to get into that because that's another long question.
Emergence is an endlessly fascinating topic, and also one that I feel like I have a relatively good intuition for. Maybe that's what's the effect where somebody who has a little knowledge overestimates their competency. But I feel like I spot people using the idea of emergence in a sloppy explanatory fashion, but maybe I do the same thing and I just don't notice it.
Yeah, is that the what, like the destiny effect, the Wikipedia Redditor kind of experience?
Yeah, there's Dunning-Kruger is probably what I was thinking of.
Dunning-Kruger,
yeah. All right, 14 is your first score, so you're off to a racing start. Round 2: ethics, history, or metaphysics.
I feel like I'm obliged to pick history, considering it's my field of study. But
all right, well, here's your 3 options. Women in history have been systematically underrepresented. Religion is the most potent force in shaping civilizations, or the notion of linear progress in history is a myth. 3 pretty chunky subjects to choose from here.
Yeah, I think I'm going to go with the notion of linear progress in history is a myth. And
all right.
I'm going to, I guess, attack the proposition. Well, no, I'm defending the proposition that it is a myth. So I guess that means I'm not attacking the proposition.
You're defending the assertion.
Yeah.
The assertion's just been unnecessarily put in a negative form.
Yeah.
So what shape is history?
I don't think it's secular. Oh God, that's a word I can't say right now. I don't think it's
not shaped like a circle.
No. And I mean, I guess in some metaphysical sense, you say like the literal time, like time itself is linear, I would say. But history as like a human consideration can go in any direction at any moment because humans are volitional beings. There's no necessary shape or I guess progress as a concept, right? Progress is kind of a it wasn't defined by Hegel, but it's kind of a Hegelian concept that history is some pursuit towards an end, right? That there are particular developments in history that add something new to the human corpus, and those human inventions stack on top of one another and almost necessitate the next level of step, right? Like if the Reformation happens and there's now this question of Catholic orthodoxy. There's now questions that you have to ask about the future of religion and the future of Western civilization that almost seem like, well, you have to answer those questions because how are you going to continue the civilizational project that you've attacked what was the glue holding Western civilization together for this whole period of time? But that doesn't mean that the answers to those questions are deterministic, that like there is a correct answer to those questions and that they will be necessarily employed by civilization. I think if you look at what's happening in the world around us, people, I mean, like Foucault says that we're at the end of history. Hegel thought he was in the end of history. It seems like we're kind of going downwards rather than upwards at the moment. And that seems to very clearly imply that there's not like a linear straight upwardness. Maybe you can take a Hegelian approach and say it's a linear straight down. But, you know, there's no real evidence that there hasn't been moments of conflict and then changes in different civilizations that have happened and then receded from the primacy of the civilizational experience.
I guess to give the proponents of a linear model of history their due, they would probably accept that it's not a straight line graph or a simple function. There is some amount of oscillation, maybe there's some wiggling on the path. And the point is just that if you step back far enough, then you see trends. In a way, some of those trends are pretty difficult to argue with. For example, the total number of humans on the planet. You know, if you go back in time, you more or less will only see population going in the same direction, right? That we have vastly more people on the planet now than we did 300 years ago. And there was vastly more people on the planet 300 years ago than there were 3,000 years before that.
Well, if certain radical elements of our society get their way, ethical cannibalism will be the standard. So, you know, maybe we'll take a strong plummet for 150 years or something.
Well, maybe, but until it
maybe
happens,
in the trend
that's a
history,
lot of
that's
evidence
small.
in terms of
Yeah.
like the evidence for directionality to human history without positing future things that haven't happened yet. Like just looking at what we can see, there does seem to be, you could probably draw hundreds of similar, you know, all these things are probably correlated, but there are some things that seem to have just changed permanently in one direction for all of time with a little bit of fluctuation, but nonetheless you know, there's abilities that humans have now that they didn't used to have. There's ways of life. There's and even in microcosm, you see that other countries go through a similar set of stages to what countries that advanced earlier seem to go through, right?
I think I guess I would have to think about the question a bit differently, because I was thinking of it kind of like from a metaphysical point of view, that like history is like almost an entity of itself, like having this kind of directionality. But I think if you take the subject of history as humans very seriously, there's some sense in which humans are very we're knowledge-based creatures, right? So we make decisions based on ideas broadly, and the change in history is a change in ideas of the people who are actually acting within reality. And so there is some sense in which the growth of knowledge and the growth of, I guess, philosophical discovery and scientific discovery has pushed mankind, uh, well, given like newborns, children, young adults, more information to work with to pursue pursuits that their previous generation hadn't, and that's been
Mhm.
kind of accumulating to some degree. Um, I mean, to be fair to linear historians, I mean, it is true that it, just because certain moments in history have been like a backslide, that doesn't mean that the overall course is forward.
Mm.
But it's only forward to the degree in which men and mankind as a whole have chosen to pursue a particular focus on reality, right? Like to actually learn about reality, to actually practice principles and create more productively and socially. And whenever we decide not to do that, we won't head in that direction. We could end up in a society that takes quite a long detour. Um, and it's not necessarily the case that information will be preserved either. You know, after the fall of the Roman Empire, there was a good amount of information that was lost, and
Mm.
some of it was never recovered, and some of it was recovered later on. We almost had the steam locomotive in Roman times, like that. We were this close to a steam locomotive. You
It's
know, we
crazy.
had, and we didn't do it. So
Yeah.
and it took
Yeah.
what, another almost, depending on what dates you want to use specifically, like 12, 1300 years or something, for steam locomotives to become common. Um,
So, the way that you're describing it sounds like each civilization has a run to get as advanced as they can. It's like that game that people play where you run up a sort of, there's a big flagpole at a diagonal angle covered in butter or something. You're running along it, trying to get as far as you can before you collapse. So, we happen to exist at a moment of a technological peak, but there's no reason that you know, we won't enter another backslide that means that people lose access to the technology we have for thousands of years potentially. I mean,
I,
what are your thoughts on
yeah.
the Dark Ages?
Hmm.
Because I've
Um,
heard people
mhm,
say that the unfairly maligned as a period with a lack of innovation, and actually that was kind of a um, you know that was the Enlightenment historians
mhm.
um, kind of uh, pulling tricks. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think from any non-scientific point of view, like ethically or like human like standard of life, it was pretty abysmal. Like the vast majority of human beings ate way less than they should have each day and worked much harder than was necessitated. Well, it was necessitated because they didn't have human inventions that would make it easier to work for cheaper. But it was not a happy time in like the sense of, would I want to be put in those conditions again and have to work at that degree and get the reward that they got for that work? No. But if you're talking about like human inventiveness, um, there's some sense in which inventiveness is like a distinctly individual process. It isn't really a social wide phenomenon. And I think the fact of this is most readily shown by geniuses. It's almost, there's certain things that, don't happen without a genius to push forward the field in a particular direction. And so, um, there are moments where geniuses are going to be born at any time. It doesn't necessarily mean the time is well suited for the genius or the time is helping the genius come to be. It could be. Um, and so, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of innovation in the Dark Ages for particular scientific or philosophical projects. I mean, even just going away from science for a second, like Aquinas is a huge development, and his philosophy, you know, it's like genius level. Um, you can't really imagine the kind of impact that Aquinas writing what he did had on the world without, um, acknowledging that if without Aquinas we might have never come to some of the conclusions, or at least not for a very long time.
Mm.
And so I'm not sure it's really like a mark of the success of a civilizational project that it has a lot of inventiveness. It's
Mhm.
there's certainly contexts in which inventiveness are encouraged more than others, but I think that's about all we can say. Um, and maybe this is what you're trying to get at, that history is if we're racing towards like on this upward trajectory until we collapse, like um, at what level is that upward trajectory, like uh the good in it of itself, and also like the linear progression towards the good before it just falters and continues again at another point? I'm not too sure how I'd answer that question, to be honest.
It's something in common between the discussion we were having in the first round and here is about the significance of human will and volition.
Mhm.
And it seems that you have have a high regard for the significance of that. That, in a way, the concept of a predictive historiography, that there's something predictable about history, would deny that um, there are genuine elements of choice and decision that affect the large scale progression of human society. And I I think it's fashionable at the moment, as I understand it, in the academy to study history in terms of um, the broad scale technological changes and the social conditions and the almost the faceless, like broad macro stuff.
The
Um,
mass.
yeah, the mass, and like we were talking about in the first round, if what you're analyzing is made up of a vast number of small similar events, then you do tend to get aggregate properties that are predictable. But actually, I think you're right that there's significant elements of human history and even current day society that are within the grasp of a small number of people, right? That make decisions and do things that matter. And you can really have society at a crossroads where a decision can be made one way or the other that has vast impacts. And the decision is not an aggregate decision of the populace. It is some people will maybe a person in some way. You could trace it all back to there's an individual, I don't know, Caesar crossing the Rubicon, right? It takes a certain moment in history where all of the significant forces focus down onto a single point, and you could say that really was a moment where things could have gone either way. So do you agree with me with my framing there, um, that we should think of history in terms of the whims or decisions of a few people in a significant way?
I I think it has an extraordinary effect. I'm not sure it's the only like interesting thing to talk about historically, because there are things that people do at the ground level, right? Revolts and revolutions have always been somewhat popular in origin and have changed history quite a bit. I mean, to take it to the position of history, I can more readily speak about in the American Civil War context.
Hmm.
The I mean, there's two like opposing figures at some level, Lincoln and I would say Justice Taney, the justice who's the Taney Court. I mean, he's the chief justice at the time, who delivered the Dred Scott case and other similar cases, which essentially necessitated a violent conflict. There could have maybe been a historical resolution of the North and the South, but the court essentially saying no government is legally allowed to discuss the issue of slavery, forced physical arms to become the relevant political tool, right? And so Lincoln, as sort of the champion of the North, goes, well, I mean, you've kind of tied our hands here. We got to resolve this somehow. And if you're not going to make it happen by political means, we're going to do it by violent means. And so he takes a historical role of leading the war, winning the war. And I mean, you could come away from that saying like Justice Taney and Lincoln were two egos that were fighting with one another, and that was what was driving history forward. But it is also the case that slavery has its own nature from like in the life of man, right? Like people on the level of the individual within society are grappling with questions of slavery and are seeing it quite boldly in their face. I mean, like in Priggs, Pennsylvania, I mean, this girl was essentially a freed slave, and she was kidnapped and returned to a slave state. And people are like, well, like if they can do this, what can't they do? Does human dignity mean anything? Do rights matter? And so the individual people were making the topic on slavery, where Taney and Lincoln are answering and concluding the topic through the Civil War and through court procedures.
So do you think the opinions of everyday people on slavery was a completely emergent effect? As in, did the people, as I mean, I'm not enormously informed on American history, I have to admit, but my understanding is most of the people in the North thought that slavery should be abolished, and most of the people in the South thought that it shouldn't. Is that an oversimplification?
No, that's generally true. But the question
was that
less
the effect
on
of like all the people in the North just independently came to that conclusion, and the people in the South independently came to the opposite conclusion, or were they influenced by their environment? And although they probably, a lot of them independently felt like they had reasoned it through and came to their own viewpoint, but in fact, their opinions were formed for them. So it still was not a case of it's this. You were sort of making the case, I think, that the opinions of the masses bubbled up and affected the course of human history. And I guess what I'm saying is that the opinions actually were more formed anyway. So it still wasn't a causal factor.
I think it's an interesting question because I think the issue of slavery for the North and the South wasn't really an issue of slavery directly. It was an issue, like a view of human dignity. Was the Declaration of Independence a new way to form civilization? Are we going to take it seriously and live by it? Or was the constitutional and political project merely a means of detaching ourselves from England and Western civilization prior and creating a new nation? If the answer is it was just a departure, whatever we can do, I mean, whatever we do is justified. Like if we have political will to do it, we'll do it. If the Declaration of Independence and the War of Revolution was for a purpose, to create a particular kind of civilizational project based on the words of the Declaration of Independence, then slavery is a huge problem, because it's very stark that the words of the Declaration of Independence do not allow for slavery to be a part of American civilizational order. And so I think the North was like the individual civilians of the North were invested in and seriously took much more seriously the civilizational project presented in the Declaration of Independence, whereas the people in the South took their pragmatic political reality as the priority, and they were viewing the political actions that the North took in the presidency and in the Congress as like an attack against Southern identity and Southern existence. And so they weren't really concerned with the broader American project. They were concerned only with the Southern project. But that happens.
That's
I
interesting.
think it does happen at the individual level. People are making those decisions.
Yeah. So I suppose the details of what the well, I was going to say aside, but maybe more the question is like, why was it that the people of the North, the northern states, right, were all minded, like you say, kind of ideologically, to consider the founding of America in one way, and all the people in the South felt about it so entirely differently, that I would expect, and as I say, I haven't looked into it, that there were certain key thinkers and leaders who were really driving the discourse, and that most ordinary people were much more following in the sway of as I say, the causal effect seems to me that it usually goes top down rather than bottom up.
There's an excellent book, anybody who's interested in the subject, by Donald S. Lutz, called The Origins of American Constitutionalism, which focuses on the colonial period. So pre-Declaration of Independence, etc. And he emphasizes that like of the 13 colonies, there were 3 different political subcultures. The South had like a traditionalistic, almost English political culture. The far north, New England area, had like a moralistic, like Puritan-based political culture, and then the middle had a more commercial, individualistic culture. So when we're talking about the North and the South, at some level, it's kind of the political individualist and political moralistic cultures that are coming to the conclusions of American, the dignity of man in America, whereas the South's like, we're kind of just the English project too, so we don't really need to consider these questions that deeply, or we already have answers to them because they worked successfully in England. And I think it is true that there's certainly influential figures in each political culture. It's not like the individualistic or the moralistic culture didn't have those figures. But it is also true that popular sovereignty as a term expanded dramatically in that period. I mean, we're talking about covenantal projects, like a covenantal people, if you think about it. The Jews of Israel or the early Americans are people who voluntarily join an agreement to live a certain way of life under God. And that's a popular decision. Like everyone in that community is agreeing to voluntarily to follow this way of life. And so there's a sense in which that isn't just a top-down conclusion. That's a bottom-up conclusion. People are trying to live in a society together, from the baker to the politician.
Well, I've just noticed the time, and we ended up spending 30 minutes on round 2. If this continues, we're going to be spending 40 minutes on round 3, 50 minutes on round 4, and then a full hour on the last round. So we must at least avoid the linear progression of round timings. I'm going to give you 15 for that round. Very well done. And that brings us to cinema and theatre, world affairs, or epistemology.
Why don't we do cinema and theatre? Getting on the artistic side of it.
Adaptations, sequels, and remakes stifle originality. Casting should reflect demographic realities, or music is the most important element of a film.
I think I want to take up the adaptation, sequels, and remakes, and I want to argue for its stifling originality. I I'm sure you've probably heard a lot about Dune and been talking about it to death with people, but
I'm
it's
happy
on
to
my
talk about
mind.
it.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
it's on my mind quite a bit. Um, as a Dune fan, like the original Dune Frank Herbert fan, um, there's a sense in which a story can only be told once, right? You're only
Mm,
really like speaking about one universe, one whole, one presentation of characters, and any uh, new version of that is fundamentally a different kind of story. Um,
mm.
it, the original Dune movie, the 1984, oh God, I forget the name of the director. Um,
Oh no, now I'm blanking on it as well. In fact, it's a director who came up on a previous episode of the Gauntlet, and I didn't even mention that he did Dune. Um, it's
David Lynch.
Lynch, yes.
Yeah. Um, his his version of it was a particular kind of interpretation, and while it's very, it's not the same as the Dune universe. It's kind of um, interestingly faithful in some ways, at
Hmm.
least to like the purpose of the plot. I mean, you can get into particulars like, oh, why is this cat getting milked in this scene? What does that have to do with anything in the story? But um, it was an interesting interpretation, and it was a new presentation of Dune. Um, but it wasn't the same story. And then you come to the new version of Dune, and it, I don't know if it's like a linear progression from original product, new product, and then future product, but this version is like even more devoid of the content of the original Dune. It's like there has been a progression away from um, an actual investigation of the story themes, and it's almost also away from any investigation of story themes, right? So the Dune novel is about the direction of humanity. Are we going to go this way? Or are we going to go that way? How are we going
Mm.
to decide these questions? And who is making the decision?
Hmm.
The 1984 version of Dune is kind of like, how are all of these like political groups influencing decisions toward a particular goal? It's less about directionality of humanity. It's less about universal conceits about mankind. And this new version is like almost nothing on universal considerations of mankind. And if you think originality really is a discussion of those questions that are most important to humankind, you're never going to get that kind of discussion more clearly stated by a sequel or adaptation than the original, because now it
Mm.
has to reinterpret the corpus, which was actually a focus on that question, and has to do it in a way that's different. And so it's like the form of the movie is, or the form of the book or the movie is directed towards this kind of question, and then it's hijacked to ask a different kind of question. It's like, why even have the form of the movie, because it doesn't really suit that kind of question anymore. And
Mm.
is that original? I don't know.
I always think that any work of art is inevitably a product of the people and the culture and the time that it was made. And
Hmm.
obviously, Frank Herbert was using Dune to, partly he was writing a book for the purpose of entertainment, but as with most science fiction, he was using it as a platform to forward his viewpoints on various things. And I think in the case of Dune, it was quite explicitly written in kind of in response to Isaac Asimov, and there's kind of interesting stuff where you can take the Foundations books and could kind of compare and contrast and then you go and look at the statements, like the straightforward political commentary that the authors have each made outside of their created universe, and you go and trace and find out, oh yeah, well, so this in-world thing that I was speculating was trying to make a political point. Now I feel pretty confident that it was, because there's there's the point that I thought it was making spelled out in black and white by the author. And then if you look at what Denis Villeneuve has said in interviews when he's talking about Dune, it seems like the things that he cares about are like the powerful female characters and the kind of theme of he probably is not a million miles away from Frank Herbert in that he, I think, has some sort of anti-religious sentiments that he's trying to get across in the film. In the story of Dune is quite cynical, isn't it? About the Messiah is a completely fictional person, and the religion functions mostly as a weapon for the powerful to use. But he's kind of using because Villeneuve and Herbert don't agree on everything, but Villeneuve is handcuffed to the Dune story that he's trying to adapt. It can't be this full-chested expression of Villeneuve's ideas in the same way that the book was. So I think I'm agreeing with you. The original version of any story is the one that can express its themes on every level.
I mean, even the plot of Dune, if you see how much he had to remove from the plot of Dune to tell the story he wanted to tell, it's staggering. Like, almost every single group in the original Dune is removed. The Guild don't exist. You know, there's no presentation of the difference between the Harkonnens and Atreides, really. It's like very, very weak. And then the Bene Gesserit are like, I'm not even sure what their motivation is in the new Dune movies. They just kind of exist. And it's like, if you had to remove all these features and you still are stifled to express exactly what you want to say about the universe, about human life, about I guess an aesthetic view of mankind. Well, he did as much as he could to remove himself away from the original product. It wasn't as if he was like faithfully putting in every scene.
Trouble is that you're, as I say, you're handcuffed. Because, for example, I think you can see that Villeneuve wanted Chani to be almost the focus, the central driving character in what is the second half of the book. And if he had been making up the story, I think he would have taken it in a different direction. So whereas Herbert is, in a way, the role of Paul is that he is a male who has the powers of the Bene Gesserit, and because he's a male, he can actually take it further than they. Like, he's actually more powerful than any of the rest of them. That theme is kind of unacceptable to a modern director. So you have to find a way around that. You can't make a film where it's like, oh, the main character is powerful because he's a male. So he loves the theme that the women are the ones pulling all the strings, and that the emperor is relatively inert compared to the witches that he's surrounded by. And that's kind of there in the sort. But what I'm saying is that you can only deviate so far from the plot. So if there's an element of the original concept that you're uncomfortable with, you're gonna have to just grit your teeth and put in something that is conceptually at odds with other things that you're trying to do.
I mean, it's funny because the end of Dune, the last line of the actual Dune book, is a radically feminine expression of power and their influence, but they can't put it in the movie because they've assassinated Jessica's character, and they can't have this relationship between Jessica and Chani. So the moment in Dune where Chani has the most independence and like her role is emphasized is at the end where it says like history will, I mean, people today will call these women wives, but they will live worse than concubines. They'll never feel the tenderness of expression and touch of their husband, and yet we who are called concubines are who will be remembered by history as wives. That's an expression of like you will gain what you want from the universe, even if like we're performing this way within the civilizational order right now. So it's like at the end you actually do win. Like you're going to win, you're going to be the historical figure that's remembered. But you can't do that if you've made the story about how Chani actually hates Luke, hates his mother and hates him, right? You can't have her have that tender moment at the end. And so it kind of you miss this whole thing that would have really promoted the story if you wanted to talk about female empowerment and the role of women as like puppeteering everything. That was basically how the book ended. But artistic decisions stifle you from getting there.
You kind of in slipping and mentioning Luke brings me on to an interesting topic, which is the influence of Dune on Star Wars. And in a way, you could argue that that's the healthy way of progressing art and culture, is that George Lucas would have read Dune. There were certain elements of it that stuck with him and were meaningful, but he was making a thing out of like cobbling together from thousands of influences. So if you compare the kind of quote unquote influence of the Dune books on the recent Dune movies versus the influence of Dune on Star Wars, Star Wars holds together in a way as a true auteur project where every element of it, as whether it's influenced or not, is in service of a single idea that is at the from the soul of the director. Whereas making a adaptation or a remake, as the director, you're kind of slavishly following a project that has been set out in advance, and your scope for expression within the project is enormously reduced, consequently producing a weaker, less interesting, less powerful, less important product at the end of it.
I think that's absolutely correct.
Good. All right. Well, tell you what, let me bring that round to an end, and well done on speeding things up. I'm going to give you another 15.
There you go. Thank you.
Psychology, elite theory, or theology?
I feel like I'm prized into picking elite theory, but I don't want to, so I'm not going to. Even though we've kind of already started.
We've already talked about it.
Yeah,
we've covered that.
Why don't we go theology?
All right. Morality derives from God's commands. The doctrine of the Trinity is incoherent, or God is omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, and benevolent. I feel like the last one is such a mammoth mountain to climb that I give you an extra point if you pick that, just for. I'm not trying to steer your decision here, but all I'm saying is, that's a lot to cover in 10 minutes. So
honestly, I kind of want to talk about the second one because I want to talk about I guess a related subject, which is like Jesus as a figure of the Trinity and,
Mhm.
and its effect on religious interpretation. Um, what do you think about? I guess part of the Reformation in its historical significance is a change away from a Catholic orthodoxy, like a rigid Catholic orthodoxy, towards another kind of pursuit. And even the English Reformation, concludes with the creation of the head of state still being the head of the church in the Church of England, right? So it isn't exactly addressing the the sort of ecclesiastical structure questions that people were fighting against. Um, and I mean, that basically necessitates the first Puritans to leave England and try to form a new kind of civilization, to have a personal relationship with God rather than a organized, delimited, and sort of intermediate relationship with God, where the priest or priesthood interprets for the individual how this kind of relationship should go. Um,
Mm.
do you think I'm trying to tailor my question here specifically. Do you think I guess that the orthodoxy of the Trinity and the doctrine of the Catholic Church, maybe more broadly, is actually kind of a betrayal of the Old Testament and of Jesus, because it doesn't
Wow.
seem exactly consequent with the following the project of Jesus. It's kind of a different project.
Wow. Okay, this is a spicy question.
Yeah.
um, so the I've often uh, said that the the Trinity as a banner theological topic hides within it quite a lot of. It's actually not that different from the thing we were talking about in the first round, where we were saying that in quantum mechanics, you've got all these quite unexpected um, observations, very well believed, convincing. You can test them a million times. You've got very well-known error bounds. It's really precise finding. It's just that putting all the puzzle pieces together is really difficult to do. And I think it's the same way in this topic, that there are lots of little ideas that are presented in scripture, including things that Jesus says himself and does, that require a mental model, some high level pulling together of the strings into one thing. So a lot of the early history of the church, like the writings that we see in the first couple of centuries after Christ, are people proposing maybe this is how it works, and then that's a heresy. You're being kicked out. A lot of persecuting and killing people, and I think that. Oh, so yes, I was coming around to that. I think because we present at a popular level the Trinity in quite a straightforward way, we actually lead people to think that it is simpler and better understood than it really is. You know, we're talking about something that is not given to us in so many words in Scripture, right? The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit is formulated as things like three unique centers of conscious personhood who yet manifest as a single being, or all these kind of. And I guess you can kind of get there, but I still feel like those phrases slightly elude some of the mystery. and yet I also probably do agree that most of the various heresies were genuine heresies, in that like
Hmm.
the things that were being decried needed rebuking. I don't know if they necessarily needed quite the level of persecution. That's kind of a separate topic, but like
Yeah.
Jesus definitely um in his ministry was challenged a bunch of times, and people were confused about who he was, and he kind of didn't make it entirely clear. But I would also argue that he did claim divinity, um, and we could go into the kind of evidence of that from the Gospels, of like, where do we see Jesus? Because I've talked to non-Trinitarian Christians, um, who will actually question this and say, actually, Jesus wasn't divine. I think that the most obvious and straightforward reading of scriptures is that uh, Jesus was in fairly much the standard Orthodox way that Catholic teaching goes, um, was in a sense God, but in another sense there was some distinction between him and the Father that allowed him to be subservient to the will of the Father, for example. So you have this is what I'm talking about, is like
Yeah. Yeah.
individual kind of points of, and then you go, okay, so that's two, and then you've got the Holy Spirit, and then there is, various clues about the interrelationship between the Spirit and the Father and the Son, and so on. So um, there was a lot of words
Yeah.
probably to say that I actually think you can derive the majority of what is meant by the idea of the Trinity just, sola scriptura, which is a very Protestant thing to say. Um, I just think that some of the formulations are uh, uh, it, are overly confident. Maybe that's the best way to
Yeah.
put it. That
Well,
that
just to make
we
sure
go on, yeah.
I understand your point.
Hmm.
So there's this mystery of the Trinity and other subjects within the Scripture, and
Mhm.
you kind of have to pragmatically, or like um, through discussion at some point, maybe even involved in accidental heresies, you have to kind of piece things together to come to some conclusion, because it wasn't transparently laid out in clear language. You have to
Mhm.
now interpret and create the correct conclusion from the pieces that exist, because they're there for you to deal with, but they're not put together for you. And so the Catholic doctrine of the Trinity is an attempt to piece together the parts of the Bible to come to some metaphysically correct conclusion about the nature of divinity.
Yeah,
Um,
and it's an exercise in a way in systematics. So you can do theology as, I'm going to study this one verse, um, and figure out what it means. But you can go from the other direction. I'm going to think about broad categories, and I'm going to study this concept, and that would be a systematic approach to theology. And I think there is a kind of wise skepticism that people develop about systematic theology, where you go, it's not the best starting place. It's kind of an interesting revision tool, almost, that, okay, once you've read the Bible and got a real intuitive sense for what it actually says, then you can then, it's quite interesting to think about things categorically. But if you start from categories, there's a tendency that you jump to a conclusion and then find scriptural evidence that supports what you already had in your mind.
have you ever read Two Brothers Karamazov?
Actually, I've read a significant amount of it. I never finished it, sadly,
Well,
but
you've probably read this part. There's a section in that where one of, I think it's a priest, is discussing with one of the family, like a family lawyer, I think it was, on the nature of the church and the state. And like there's two
Mhm.
proposed paths that the Catholic Church and post-Christian doctrine could have gone. You could have had the state become the church, or you could have had the church become the state. And it seems kind of like, from a straightforward reading of the gospel and from Jesus's ministry, that it would be appropriate for the state to become the church. Everything should eventually become the church, because we can settle matters non-violently, I suppose. Whereas the sort of post-Jesus actual creation of institutions and civilization was kind of like turning the church into the head of state. And so it wasn't necessarily this project that was, I guess, some of the pragmatic reasons why the doctrine of the Trinity ends up being central is because these questions are being decided at a level of statehood. You have to have state answers to these questions, because you have like countries fighting each other for interpretation of the proper meaning of this. Whereas if everything was the church, you wouldn't really need like a strict doctrine of the Trinity in, I guess, like a form that's like heretical versus non-heretical. So I wonder if you think that has anything to do with the development of the concept of the Trinity, the historical place the Catholic Church had.
Yeah, that's interesting. Did you want to read a passage from Brothers Karamazov, or was that just?
I mean, I could pull one up, but I'd have to.
No, it's okay. I thought you were leading into it, and
no, just
anyone wants to read what you mean. Yes.
Yeah.
Go and look. Yeah, definitely, highly recommend it as a book.
I mean, it's a great book, and if you want to look at just that passage, if you just look up Two Brothers Karamazov and like the church becomes the state, or the state becomes the church, it'll be the first thing that pops up, with like a huge 2, 3, 4 page dissertation on the subject. But you should read the book entirely.
Yeah. Now, to give, I guess, my background that's relevant here is I grew up in a Baptist church, and I often think of Baptists as the form of church that is most American in its flavor, right? That there's a great belief in the autonomy of individual churches, and indeed even within a church, that each individual, there's a great focus on kind of individual faith over, if you compare it to a lot of other church traditions that have more of a focus on institutions, families, and then obviously something like the Church of England or the Catholic Church in other bits of Europe, the actual institutionalization of so my default way of looking at Jesus's teaching is to see that he was actually neither wanting the church to become the state nor the state to become the church. So some of the clues that I would have cited there would be that when he's asked about the Roman occupation of Israel, he basically said, pay your taxes, or at least it's acceptable to pay your taxes. It's probably a fairer way of interpreting the render unto Caesar passage. When he's on trial, he says that my kingdom is not of this world. And several times people push him, like, are you gonna try and seize political power? You've got all these followers. Are you going to overthrow the rulers? And he kind of repeatedly insisted, like, the kingdom of God is at hand, but it's not a political kingdom. So this way of reading Jesus's ministry is to say that we as Christians should expect to be in a situation where we have a hostile government, and the question is, how do you live as a Christian in that context? But then there's a kind of secondary question of, okay, but suppose you and a bunch of other Christians find yourselves in power in a country, then how are you going to run things? And of course, the American project is interesting there because the people who founded America, by and large, did believe in God, and whether they were actually Christians or just kind of sympathetic deists, they chose to build a secular state, right? They didn't want an established church, which is different from a lot of the history of Christendom in Europe, probably quite influenced by the French Revolution. I guess you probably would know a lot more about all this than me. But yes, sorry. What was the original question? Was the
I
Trinity
guess
an outworking? Do you want to comment on that, and then I'll come back to the actual question?
Yeah, I think there's something very distinct about American religion in that it's very it's much closer to Judaism than it is Christianity in some ways, right? The relationship between God and his people is very similar for the Americans as it is to the Jews. The God has a direct covenant with you to like, if you follow my word, if you live this way, if you pursue a good life on earth based on my teachings, then I will bless you. I will make sure your endeavors work out in your favor. It's kind of the presentation of the Jewish way of life, and the same with the American, right? That's why they focus so much on creating individual churches of that community which had a direct relationship with God. And so I think that does change quite a bit what your interpretation of the scripture is, because now you have a personal relationship with God instead of like a civilizational relationship, which has implications.
Okay, so just connect for me again the Catholic model of connecting church and society with the interpretation of the Trinity.
Yeah, it seems to me that there needed to be a strong, clear position on the Trinity as this well understood, clearly defined concept from the scripture, because the church was becoming the head of state. So they could not move on with their civilizational project. They could not function as a society without giving a clear answer to that. And it's necessitated conflict among various European groups, because and also with Islamic groups, because you have to have this be correct if the church is going to be the head of the state. If the church isn't the head of state, you don't necessarily need a rigid doctrine of the Trinity, or have to come to a conclusion that's standardized.
Are you saying that just because it is an important theological topic, that this is not specific to the Trinity? The same argument would apply to any other significant areas of uncertainty theologically, that the Catholics had to nail down every one of their beliefs in order to maintain power. Is that what you're saying?
I think there's some sense in which that's true, but there's another sense in which the Trinity is like the question, because it has to do with Jesus, and it has to do with God, and it has to do with, I'm less sympathetic to the concept of the Holy Spirit, but those two topics is like the religion. Like, you can't really like having alternating views on what Jesus was is like disastrous for the entire religious project. You can't really do that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I suppose the relevant hypothetical here is what would have been, with how much zeal would Christians have felt about their doctrines without the factor of earthly political power being part of the question? Because you're sort of saying that the incentives were formed by the necessity to maintain control. Now, We know that there was a lot of there's a lot of warnings in the New Testament about false teachers, and there's discussion about various theological things in quite heated terms. Paul and Peter, they were probably the two biggest names on campus, as it were, at that time, were at each other's throats over the questions of, like, should the Jews be expecting the Christians to get circumcised? Should they eat together? Like, how sectarian should a church be? Um, and the attitude towards false teachers is that they're wolves in sheep's clothing, and you have to throw them out. You have to, like, really watch out and be zealous for truth. So I guess I'm thinking that there's probably reason to expect for Christians to be to be zealously guarding their beliefs against false teaching. But then on the other hand, you've got ideas like, should you eat food that has been sacrificed to idols? Well, the advice is, if it's been sacrificed to idols and the idols aren't real, it doesn't actually matter. So if you end up with the food and you're happy to eat it in private, go ahead. It's not actually it's not an issue. However, if there's people around who are going to be upset thinking that you're doing something blasphemous, then there's other examples, right? Should you observe holy days? And the answer is actually, try to live in harmony as a church, and don't make a big deal out of something that's a secondary issue. So that, on the flip side, would say, okay, suppose you've got a group of believers together. Somebody in that group is teaching, or at least believes and is expressing that opinion, that let's say, I'm trying to think of a sort of mild Christological heresy. I don't know.
Yeah.
So say the idea that Jesus was a man, a normal human, until his baptism. I think this is what the Christadelphians teach. So at the baptism, John baptized Jesus, and there's the Holy Spirit descends as a dove, and you have the Father speaking and says, "This is my Son, with whom I am well pleased." So it's one of the few passages in Scripture where you actually see all three elements of the Trinity in a single in a single passage, and they're all relating to each other in some way. So it's quite interesting on the subject of the Trinity. So the Christadelphians would say that was the moment at which Jesus became divine, and he wasn't previously. And this is a heresy, according to the Catholics, of course, who believe that Jesus was already part of the Godhead at his conception. So the practical question is, how big of an issue is it that this person has this belief? And at what level do you want to persecute and throw him out if you disagree? And I think that's quite a difficult question, because I think every single Christian has a unique set of beliefs to
Yeah.
some degree. There'll be, like, if you go far enough in the weeds, they'll have some point of disagreement. Everybody disagrees with
Yeah.
everybody at some level.
There won't be much blood of Christians left on earth if we kill every Christian who believes something different
Yeah.
in the Catholic Church.
So the question is, at what level of agreement do you need to get? And I actually think that the way that Jesus and the New Testament writers think about this is actually generally much more about the behavior of the people. It's like, by their fruits you will know them. So it's kind of the idea, I guess, that if somebody has a wacky belief about some doctrinal matter, maybe don't let them teach, but you will probably have some matter of church discipline that arises from them if they're not genuinely a Christian, if they're not saved. That the kind of theological heresies don't matter as much as sin matters, and unrepentant sin in particular. So sorry, this has been a very very long-winded way of getting around to your original question. Is the fact that Catholics have such a precise and I guess we've both kind of implied overly confident, overly precise teaching on the Trinity, which actually isn't a point of great disagreement with most Protestants, to be fair. Like the majority of Protestants would affirm, the vast majority of the things that the Catholic Church teaches about the Trinity. But did that arise out of the political power that the Catholic Church was gaining? And I guess it's also relevant to, for example, in America, you've got the question of Christian nationalism, right? Which is, I guess, by your accounting, an un-American idea in some ways of an establishment of Christian ideas in a conscious and deliberate way, rather than merely having a process and in a democratically arising Christian synthesis of idea.
Ecclesiastical structure.
Yeah, I think my answer is going to have to be that I don't know enough about the history to say. It seems like a plausible idea to me. I can see where you're going with it, and I think with further research, I'd probably come to a conclusion if that was.
Sure.
It sounds to me like that was a factor. Yes. But I can believe actually that even inside of a persecuted church, people can still be very zealous over their doctrines out of a genuine feeling that the minutiae matter. So you could have ended up with a group of people settling on a quite precise. I mean, you've got the split between the Gnostics and the mainline church before Constantine. So, I mean, that's an example of two groups of people calling each other heretics that was prior to the church having political power, as I understand it.
Well, I think a lot of the confusion and necessity, I guess, for that to be, I think you're right in that sense. Is like the difference between the New and Old Testament. You really have to, like, there's a lot of ways you can go, and it's almost even. I mean, you can even say, like, just within the New Testament, there's a lot of conflict, but like especially between the New and Old Testament, there's a lot of conflict, and I mean that almost necessitates different answers to questions, and people are going to think about them strongly or less strongly depending on what's happening in the world, or how much they hold the belief.
Do you mind me asking what your background is? Like you hinted towards having a heterodox perspective on the Holy Spirit, perhaps. Where do you come from?
I mean, I'm an atheist, but
okay. So you don't care either way.
I'm interested in these questions, so. And I think they do.
So when you say you're not so sure about the Holy Spirit, then you're sort of you're taking a hypothetical. If I was a Christian, this is the position I'd end up in.
Well, I find certain things in the worldview more, I guess, like I can feel sympathetic towards them. I can feel really like engaged with them. I can feel like it's a shared Christian project of civilization at some level, whereas some other factors like seem less about our shared identity together and more about particular religious beliefs of sects or whatnot. But I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a bit of a cheeky thing to say. Like I don't know about the Holy Spirit when I don't know about any of it. But
You're right. Yeah. Yeah. I don't. Yeah. I'm not sure if I believe in the Holy Spirit. I also don't believe in God. So that's probably
yeah.
that's probably a factor. Okay. Yeah. I like to think that I run a kind of simulation of myself as an atheist. Like, what would I think about these topics? But I
Yeah.
don't know how deeply I can run that simulation of, if I was an atheist, would I also be running a simulation of me as a Christian, and how accurate would that be?
Yeah. Sure.
All right. Well, unless you have any final comments on that round, I suggest we close it out. Although I feel like I was doing most of the answering there, so I should give
Well, I'm
myself a
happy to
score,
hear
and
from
I
you.
did
So
excellently.
yeah.
No, that's fair. It is a ridiculous concept that I'm giving a score, and as such, I'm going to give you 15 as a particularly ridiculous number, as 15 is. Technology, natural science, or Christology?
I think technology is probably the thing we've talked least about. So.
By the way, this is only round 5. We've still got 2 rounds to go. So,
God, I didn't even know there was 7 rounds. So Jesus.
there's not. There's this round, and then there's next round, and then we're done.
Oh,
So,
okay.
round
2
5.
rounds. There you go. 6.
Automation will have a net positive impact. Virtual reality will pacify the oppressed masses, or surveillance technology destroys personal freedoms.
Huh. This is an interesting set of propositions because some of the topics fight the other topics, right? I think I'll take up the second one on virtual reality will pacify the oppressed masses.
Are you arguing for or against?
I'm gonna argue for in a very delimited sense, in that if we proceed as we have without answering certain questions in society, this will be the results. I don't think it's like this will happen, but this is where we're heading. I think,
well, as we previously discussed, you have a high view of human volition as a factor. So you'd never make a prediction about the future as if you have a crystal ball.
Sure. But virtual reality, I mean, I've seen a lot of these new Apple Vision videos where people are like walking. There's the one where he's like dating his girlfriend, who's also in a I think they're married. I think they were married. I think they were both wearing Apple Visions, looking at each other through the Apple Vision, and it's I don't know. It's absolutely like you don't even have interaction with reality anymore. There's no feedback of a serious sense. Like you're getting like this. First off, it's like delayed by seconds, so like you're off by like a 3/4 of a second or something. So your vision's directly changed. But then even like the augmentation of reality, right? To like put objects in particular parts of your view, to block out certain objects, to possibly just remove all of sight, right? You just like put yourself in like a black box or like on the moon, and that's what you see now. Like those features lend very easily to I guess manipulation of information for one's own emotional status, right? You say, I don't want to look at this riot happening in front of me. Guess it's time to turn on the Apple Vision switch and go to the moon because that's more relaxing. And
I've ended up quoting Douglas Adams several times on these Gauntlet shows for some reasons. But do you remember the little passage that says the leading cause for one of the leading causes of death in the universe is stress. So we've developed these goggles that when they detect that you're stressed, they will become opaque, and then you can't see the thing that's stressing you out. And therefore, you'll be perfectly safe. It's a bit like you're kind of proposing that that's literally what's going to happen.
I mean, that's kind of like, there are mistakes with that too, though, right? Like, even if you put on a visor, you still know at some level that there's something happening out there that you're stressed out about. Even if you block it out from vision, it doesn't go away. And I guess the societal question, or the interesting question, is something. It's somewhat similar to my thoughts on meditation, where people will break away from conscious experience to sort of like remove their emotions and then be able to be in a state to proceed onward with some new action. But it severs the continuity between the previous states of your life and the next state of your life by just like emotionally purging it. I think there's something deeply wrong with that emotional purge, except for maybe very particular uses. Like, you have to go on stage or something. You need to get this to have this kind of functional purpose. You need to break away a little bit from your previous emotional experience. But there's something very particular about the human experience that seems like a continuity, that we have an elongated emotional experiences that accumulates and changes and interacts with other emotional states, that makes it like virtual reality really is like just clear and easy hard breaks from previous experiences, as well as just from reality itself. And it makes it hard to even say that you're living a human experience now, that you're like segmenting your life off in this like automated robotic kind of like computer programming way. It's very strange.
Now, if there was a situation where the vast majority of mankind were plugged into some kind of a virtual reality that was completely convincing and actually provided them with a very near facsimile to the dream life of a billionaire. They could drive fast cars. Maybe they could fly a jet around. They could have delicious food. They're kind of lulled into the belief that their body is kind of actually experiencing life as if they were extremely free, extremely wealthy. But it was all an illusion. And in fact, there were a small number of people who were given true freedom to actually leave their houses, and they were all forced into effectively prison cells with this technology. So the question is, would those people be oppressed if they believed themselves to be, enjoying lots of things? If they don't have the choice to leave, but at the same time, they've kind of been effectively sedated. Is that oppression?
Isn't that basically the experience of heroin? Like, if you had heroin with none of the physical health downsides, like it's like achieving all of the things that successful people do with no context, right? You're just is that really how we view, I guess, the human experience? That it's a good thing that to continue on the continuity point, part of the impressiveness of being widely successful, an entrepreneur, a scientific mind, etc., is that you were once not that, and you have this continued state that's built up towards this feeling, which is a whole realization of both your past self, your present self, and your future self. To just like take a pill to feel happy or something is to detach yourself from that experience purposefully. And so if the question is, are you oppressed by doing that? You are oppressed, but you're oppressed by yourself. Like, you've severed the connection between your life as a whole over a broad spectrum for just your life right now. And it's probably also true that you're oppressed by the government if they're like keeping you in a cage or something, but that's less that's less pressing in your mind than the fact that you've now oppressed yourself as this new simulation enjoyer. Um,
Yeah, so I guess that's an interesting distinction. The same scenario that I set up before, but actually you're not you're not forced into the box. It's just that the box is so much more compelling than being outside of the box that you will choose it every time. You're kind of compelled by your own will. Although, yeah, is it your will if it's compelled? Anyway, the point is, it still feels like it feels like a very similar situation, right? In either case, everybody is plugged into a fake reality,
mhm.
apart from a small number of people, and whether or not you're actually caged is slightly irrelevant. That's still, in fact, the same situation. And I think the first scenario where everybody is trapped in a prison cell, people will say, it's not really something I can believe will happen. But the second situation, I think, is self-evidently in a lot of ways already the case. Like
Yeah.
most people are in some form of the second situation where they're self-oppressing. So maybe maybe the answer is virtual reality has pacified the oppressed masses. The only problem here is the tense.
Well, I think the word pacify is also particularly interesting in the question, right? Because it pacify is really about action. It's like
Mm.
the negation of action of a particular kind. Um,
Mm.
you can think of it like from a perspective of the government, like we want you to not take this kind of action, so we pacify you by giving you virtual reality. But it can also be at a personal level. You pacify your interest in engaging with the world, building a company from the ground up, getting an education, having a family, building a community, whatever. That those are all actions you could take, but you're going to
Mhm.
pacify your own potential expression by using virtual reality. And I think that in some ways has been the case. I think, funnily enough, I don't even think you need
Mm.
virtual reality. I think people do this without virtual reality, and it's just a particularly easy tool to do it with. I mean, there's some sense to which video games is that, right? Where
Mhm.
if you become the devoted MMO player, your life is now to be peak World of Warcraft performance in the early 2000s or something. That
Mhm.
that kind of experience is you pacifying yourself from acting in the world productively for your own sake. Uh,
Mhm.
and often people just sat in their rooms playing WoW 18 hours a day.
Mm.
That was a form of pacification. Was that for
The
a
the
government
the
purpose? I don't think
difference
so.
the difference between what people immediately think of as virtual reality and all these other types of distractions, I think, is a bit of a distraction, because let's go through some of the things that people will do instead of investing into their actual lives. So you mentioned World of Warcraft, which is a virtual reality. Now, it's
Well,
not
sure, sure.
it's not immersive in quite the same way, but actually the bridge between the illusory experience and your buying into that is imagination. You have, even if you put the headset on, you're not fooled, really. You have to buy into it. But the same is true in World of Warcraft, that you invest yourself into the character, and your brain is translating the inputs and outputs that it's receiving from the computer as if it was your actual sensory. You know you you can kind of extend your body into the machine that you're driving, and you can extend your senses into whichever other sensory information you're receiving. Even reading a book is a form of virtual reality, I would argue.
Mhm.
um, if you're scrolling through videos on YouTube Shorts, you're the videos are a virtual form. You're usually seeing a person. It's as if you've been teleported so that you're standing in front of the person who's talking to you on YouTube Shorts or TikTok or whatever. All of if you take drugs and they're hallucinogenic, that is a form of virtual reality. So
Yeah.
I'm arguing that almost every form of distraction from your real life is a virtual reality. Maybe there's some drugs that are purely chemical, like it's just a pleasure hit, I guess. Is heroin closer to that, right? It's not primarily a hallucinogen, I think. I'm not sure.
I think it
But
has hallucinogenic properties, but it's not
okay.
primarily.
Oh, there you go.
I
Right.
I think I mean, just on your point on like many things can be a virtual reality. I think what's important to distinguish is the purpose of your engagement with the product, right? So if your engagement
Mhm.
with the book is to learn something that you can apply to your life, even if you get engaged with it at the level of virtual reality, the same with video games or with, you know, I guess VR goggles or something. If the purpose of your engagement of it is to take something from it and return to reality, to have an enhanced experience of reality, to help with your experience of reality, then it's probably not really a virtual reality. It's like it's purposefully like investigating something that you're not engaging with as your reality. You're engaging with it as a reality that is not, the primary reality. And so where virtual reality becomes a problem is when you decide that this virtual reality is reality, and that's what allows for pacification of action. Because if you believe this reality isn't reality but this other reality is, then it's natural to want to act more in that real reality than this fake one. You're going to take
Yes.
more effort there.
But if you perceive that your real reality is actually unconquerable, or that the chances of success in the real world are so small that there's no point trying, that's when investing your energies suddenly seems sensible in a virtual world, because at least there you can succeed. At least there is a connection between your effort and your reward. You can kind of I don't know, on your deathbed, you'll be like, well, at least I got to level 64 in WoW or whatever it is. Um, and to a degree, if you've actually assessed that correctly, that your real life actually is a completely hopeless and meaningless existence, then actually is sort of an understandable choice. So I do think the fact that these virtual realities are so compulsive to people probably says more about the lives that they're leading in the real world than the kind of strength of the virtual world, right? That it's not that we need to ban virtual reality to save people from this oppressed existence. We actually need to give people meaning and hope and purpose in their real lives. And if that real meaning seems hopeful enough, then that the strength of that is the healthy way to overcome the temptation to waste your efforts in a virtual world.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is emphasizing how important the benevolent universe premise really is. That we live in a world that's open to our values, that we can act in and be successful and achieve a purpose and have meaningful interactions with the real world with. And it's a hard premise to hold. There's a lot of things that kind of suggest that the world is actually malevolent, but I think um, like if you're looking from like a metaphysical perspective, it's clearly there's no like evil force pushing you towards failure. Whatever failure exists is like a product of nature or is a product of man and his civil society. And so if you recognize that, now you can conquer nature and you can change civil society, which makes it a lot less bleak. Though, there are contexts in which you're going to be like, well, what do I do? Like we're in a world where I can't really change that much about civil society. And so, maybe this option is more appealing. This virtual reality is superior in some sense. But I think if you also maintain a view of human beings as I guess willful, or as the theme of this discussion has emphasized, that human will is important, that you would also view your current place within society as changeable, as not something that you can't fight against, as something that is worth engaging with to pursue a new kind of life that would be more beneficial than just shutting down and entering virtual reality. And that's the end of the story.
Great. I'm going to give you 15 again for that round, which brings us to our final round: literature, software and mathematics, and eschatology.
I'm going to go with literature.
Sure. The author's intent is irrelevant to interpretation, a kind of postmodern question. The distinction between high and low genre fiction is arbitrary, or TV adaptations cannot capture the depth of the original text. Somewhat similar to what we talked about in the first round, actually.
Yeah. I want to argue that the distinction between high and low genre fiction is not arbitrary.
All right, let's hear it.
I think aesthetically, the judgments that people make while creating a project, right? So whether it's a work of art or a book, here we're talking about literature, is creating a product that has a definite quality. I don't know if I necessarily believe there's such a thing as an interaction between the reader and the work in way of interpretation. And so the actual physical volume of text, the novel, the book on science, whatever, is a objective quantity, an objective thing with these exact words and these exact configuration. Now the question is, between those created things now, are they distinct from one another in their quality? I think everyone agrees that there is some quality distinction, except from some particularly crazy postmodern people who like to say Ulysses is proving that every book is equivalent to one another. But if you don't hold that position, you have to believe that there are some objective differences between books. And if there are some objective differences between books, perhaps we can clarify what makes certain books good and certain books bad, and how
by the way,
are
you saying you are not a fan of Ulysses, and because it's not very good, then even other rubbish books should be entered into the canon? Because you're not the first guest to beat up on James Joyce on the Gauntlet.
I do not like that book. I think it's quite. I went to Ireland, and you're taking the big bus tour. They have like this thing in Dublin where you just like ride around the city in a circle, and they go to all the stops. And one of them is like James Joyce's house, or somewhere he donated to a church or a hospital, something like that. And the description of the Ulysses canon by the bus driver is both very sympathetic and very unsympathetic at the same time, and it always sticks in my mind as like, oh, this is even when you're trying to defend Ulysses, this great novel, you have to separate yourself from it and be like, I'm not a psychopath. I don't want to go kill children or something from this belief. The fact that you have to distance yourself like that probably means that the text itself is not the best literature in the world.
Well, if there's one thing we can all take away from the Gauntlet this year, it's that we should decanonize Ulysses.
I'm not sure it was ever canonized, but you know.
Well, all I'm saying is it's part of the informal canon of like Western literature. It's yes, there's no formal canon, but it's pretty frequently cited as one of the works of classic literature, and nobody likes it. So, you know, it's the weak book, as Martin Luther might say.
I mean, I think you could say that it's low genre fiction, but
Ooh,
maybe I'm
interesting.
being, you know, brazen. Um,
Interesting. Yeah.
if
Okay.
if 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 you want to ask me like what are the strict different distinctions between like this book and that book, is there like a standard that has like if you check all these boxes then you're high fiction, and if you check all these boxes you're low fiction?
Hmm.
I don't think such a standard necessarily exists, but there is the if you take a book holistically, if its purpose is to give a cohesive, presentable like way of life or world view and answer the questions and like structure the characters, the plot, the story all towards one central purpose of demonstration, then it's high fiction. If it has a singular identity and that's the purpose of the book. If it doesn't have a singular identity, or the purpose of the book is something like, I don't know, I just want to put out another James Bond book. That's not
Yeah.
exactly high fiction. Well, I really love Ian Fleming's work, but it's like
Not
you
high
can see
fiction.
like somewhere down the line, he's like the eighth James Bond book, and it's just like I'm kind of making a James Bond book. I don't really have maybe that much to say with the whole of the book. It's not like I'm giving you an answer to a human problem. It's this is just another cool book that you can read, and that was kind of the problem Sir Arthur Conan Doyle had too, where he's like, I'm done with Sherlock. I don't really want to do this anymore. And if I did it more, it would just be more
Yeah.
just making stories about, Sherlock instead of a presentation.
Famously, didn't Conan Doyle kill Sherlock Holmes, and then
Mhm.
a few years later came up with an explanation for how he hadn't really died?
After he failed to segue into a historical fiction career and
Ah,
decided to return back to Sherlock because people really
needed the
loved
money
it and he
again.
wanted to, yeah. It's
Dear me. Well, I'm convinced. I'm convinced by you, and I'm going to give you a score. Ooh, what score? 15. I feel like 15 is the score of the day. Um, and let me refresh the high score table. There you are. Equal
Ooh,
first place with
ooh.
Turnip. Wow. What a performance. You
It's I guess the T names really have it here, huh?
the
There's something
T
about the letter T.
something about 6 and 7 letter T words that just gives you the edge. So congratulations. Now you just have to go and locate Turnip and challenge him to one-to-one combat to really establish your dominance.
If I had more time, I would go grab my gloves from the closet and pull them out and theatrically throw them at the screen. So they Turnip
Yes. What is it?
knows, but
Hit him across the cheek with the outside of the glove.
yeah, yeah. That's
Well, thank you so much for playing, and very well done. You put in an excellent performance, and deservedly found yourself up with the best of them. You and Turnip, unmatched.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure, and it's been a very enjoyable conversation.
Yeah, likewise.